Now we're live. So we were just hanging out backstage and catching up a little bit, and Lenny thought that he was giving away all his good jokes, but now he has to retell them. So Mishti can kick us off, yeah?
Yeah, so super exciting. We thought we would try this very experimental thought lab format where everyone talks about building in public, but we thought we would rope in Lenny to sort of write in public with us. And he's written a bunch of awesome posts about growth, obviously, and has been sort of formulating ideas on a grand unifying theory of growth post. So we thought we'd all come together and sort of just brainstorm openly on kind of what Lenny's thinking about, and who knows, maybe one of your ideas could make it into Lenny's newsletter next. So
what an achievement.
Yeah, so definitely let's keep it a super open exchange. Lenny asks people questions, people can ask Lenny questions back, and we can get as many people up as possible in this chat.
Yeah, and quick note on the format, it's more magical when we keep it really participatory. So, feel free to add ideas and questions in the chat. We can welcome you up. And just FYI, this is on the record, including the chat. So the people who can't make it tonight can still learn from it. So we're streaming out to YouTube right now, and we will be on the record so you can watch the video after the fact on Highlighter.
Hi, YouTube. Hi, future people.
And very excitingly, we will also randomly choose someone out of anyone who shares an idea or a question tonight to give them a free subscription to Lenny's newsletter and his Slack community, which is included. So pipe up, because that is a very exciting perk.
That's an amazing offer. Thank you for doing that.
Of course.
Excited too.
Should we get started?
Sure. So let me give in case anybody doesn't know who Lenny is, I'm going to give a little bit of a background, a little bio on Lenny. So I think most people who actually are coming here already know you, but I'll just mention, Lenny, you studied computer science and engineering. You worked as a developer and engineer for a decade before creating an early location-based consumer app, which was acquired by Airbnb. Then at Airbnb, you spent 7 years working in product and growth. In the last couple of years, you've been active as a writer, an angel investor, advisor, and explorer. So the newsletter, within just a year and a half of publication, is already one of Substack's top publications, and that's at lennyrachitsky.com. And we'll link to that in the chat.
Or lennysnewsletter.com, much simpler to spell.
Ooh.
Oh, nice.
Redirects.
You got the .com on Lenny's newsletter.
Nailed it.
Cool. So yeah, I think we could just start with sort of like, Lenny, where's your head at? You've written all of these posts about growth. We linked a bunch of them in the event page. What got you thinking about the grand unifying theory idea, and how are you even thinking about how to sort of narrow down such a broad topic that has so many layers into a package that could be useful coming up next?
Yeah, it's kind of a big phrase, and so let me try to explain what I'm thinking there and kind of how I got to it and where I could use some input. So I spent my time writing this newsletter, and if you follow the newsletter, you may recognize that I'm kind of obsessed with understanding how companies grow and all of the different ways that you can grow. And so some of the posts I've written that have kind of informed this are kind of how to get your first 1,000 users if you're a consumer app, how to get your first 10 customers if you're a B2B company. And I've been working on the next phase of those things. So how to get your first 10,000 users, how do you get your first 100 customers and 200 and 500 customers? So I've been coming at it from that direction, from 0 to something. And then at the same time, I wrote this other post with my buddy Dan Hockenmeyer about long-term, what are the ways that companies grow? What are the engines of growth that continue to power growth? And it turns out there's only 4, which I'll talk about, but basically performance marketing, virality, content, which is often SEO, or sales. So those are essentially the only 4 ways that companies sustainably grow long-term. And so I kind of did these independently, but what I've been realizing more and more is there kind of this playbook I can put together from beginning to end, from 0 to 1 million, not necessarily being step 1, 2, 3, you're going to build $1 billion company, but more inspiration for here's essentially your menu of options at each of the stages, and how have companies done it in the past? What are stories of success and failure? And essentially kind of, yeah, like the grand unified theory of growth is the way I've been thinking about it. Another way of thinking about it is just like a playbook, basically, to build any company, whether it's consumer or business. And so in this chat, I kind of want to share where I'm at with it and what I'm thinking. And specifically what I'd love help on is, one, does this like make any sense as I talk through it? And is it useful? And then two, I'm trying to think of a good metaphor for describing this. Like it could be a car, it could be a rocket, it could be a flywheel, all these various ways of kind of simplifying the concepts. I'd love any advice on kind of the metaphor from beginning to end. And then I've spent a lot of time on the beginning and then at the end, but I haven't thought a lot about like the transition from you're doing all these things that don't scale and eventually you're scaling the things that you're doing. But there's this kind of middle part of transitioning between the two that would be cool to get takes on. So if you've like experienced this or have any thoughts while I go through it, that'd be awesome. Mm-hmm. And one of the, I don't know, features of highlighters, there's no presentation. So I have some notes here, but I'm just going to talk. Because I think this might be, might be easier as a deck, but I'm going to try to frame it through words and maybe it'll make sense.
Sure.
So, okay, so the question I'm trying to answer is, how do I grow my business or how do I grow my product? And what I'm finding is there's essentially 4 steps. Step 1 is identify your early adopter users who are kind of a wedge into a broader market. Step 2 is identify a value prop that resonates with these specific users. Step 3 is figure out where these users are and then go pitch them this value prop. And then step 4 is build out your growth engines that will power your growth long term. So those are just quick summary, and I'm going to talk through each of these. Okay, so step 1 is you want to figure out who is the initial early adopter customer type and profile, which will basically be a wedge into a bigger opportunity. So for example, Netflix found that DVD fanatics were their initial wedge. Cameo found it was C-list celebrities. TikTok found it was bottom tier influencers that wanted some new opportunity. WhatsApp found that it was Russian immigrants where they started. Substack found it was successful online freelance writers. Tinder found it was party-loving college students. Airbnb started with conference goers in San Francisco. Robinhood started with techie millennials. So those are some examples. So that's step 1, figure out who your initial ideal customer is to start with. Step 2 is figure out a value prop that you can pitch them to get them to use your product. So some examples, Robinhood's was no commission stock trading. Spotify was all the music in the world at your fingertips for free with ads. Dropbox was throw away your USB drive. Netflix was no due dates, no late fees, unlimited movies. DoorDash found that, so DoorDash, we'll talk about this later, but they were sales driven, and they found the pitch to restaurants was just like more revenue with no risk. So those are some examples.
And
Tinder actually.
I have a question on this. So when you're sort of listing these kind of early value props, do you think that these are things that like the teams were kind of inventing or creating at the time they created the first rev of the product, or is it like pre-product as they're thinking about what service to build, or just after they've built the product when they're trying to find their first, 10 or 20, customers or users to engage with?
So I think magic happens when you get the first 2 steps right. Some companies, it takes them a while to get there. For example, Netflix took them a long time to figure out that combination of value prop was what worked. And as soon as they got that, then growth skyrocketed. Mm-hmm. So they didn't have like the subscription element first, or they didn't have the no late fee element first, I think. And they kind of experimented. Robinhood's a good example where they nailed it immediately. They put on Hacker News. I think they put on Hacker News and went home, and then they realized their traffic was exploding. Dropbox nailed it immediately when they put it on Hacker News. Let's see what else. I think Tinder figured out, like, it took them a little while to figure out exactly how to pitch it. Where they landed was kind of like, see who is single on campus and if they like you. That's kind of where they ended up going. So I think sometimes it takes some while to figure it out, but when you do, then that's when things start to work really well. Yeah, and that's a good reminder. Like all these things I talk about, like one, a lot of these founders didn't think about it this way, and they kind of got there eventually, or it took them a long time to get there. And I forget which post of mine, I actually share how long it took for companies to get to what they call product market fit. Like Superhuman, it took them like 4 years. And a lot of I think Netflix took them a year and a half to get to this kind of point where like, wow, it's working. So the simple answer is the sooner you get there, the better.
Right. And do you think that people, though, generally are getting there kind of with the skeleton crew of team and seed funding or pre-seed type funding, and it sort of all happens before the whole, startup ecosystem emerges around these companies? Or do you get like green shoots of this and you're a year or two in, or I guess Superhuman was 4 years in, they sort of already had a pretty substantial team in place, I think, at that point. Are there any patterns to look for or watch for there?
So what I've been finding is the majority of companies that end up working out, it's pretty clear when they found something that is really compelling. It's not like a slow, methodical, year-long iteration, but there are also those cases, like Superhuman's a good example. So I think it's like, I don't know, 70% you like hit on something and it's very clear this is something people really, really want, especially in consumer. But there's, the stories where it takes a while to iterate and continue looking for product market fit. Yeah, so oftentimes I see Paul is in the audience. I don't know if he's listening, but I know he iterated on previous ideas before Clubhouse. And then I imagine when he launched Clubhouse, is like, holy shit, this is very different. People seem to really connect much more than anything else I've done. So I think that's the moment that often happens. So let me keep going through these steps and then we can talk about all these things. But that's a really good question and a really important question, because a lot of times you're like, running a company and you're like, shit, it hasn't exploded yet. What's going on? And it happens for sure and often works out. Okay. So step one is figure out who your initial wedge early adopter market is. Step two is figure out what to pitch them. And then step three is figure out where they are so you could pitch them. So it's like pretty simple if you really think about it, and maybe obvious, but what's interesting is just like the stories that these companies have share of how they do these things. So there's essentially 12 places you can go find your users, is what I've been finding. And if you've read the How to Find Your First 1,000 Users post, these are going to sound a little familiar, but there's a few more that I've kind of uncovered as I've been going past the first 1,000. And before I get into the other interesting thing I've been finding is the way to kind of conceptualize this is as little concentric circles from the founder, like how far away these people are from the founder. So at the center of this circle is the founder. So the first layer where most companies get their early users are friends and colleagues of the founder. So most companies start there. So for example, LinkedIn was like all Reed's investor friends early on. Pinterest was Ben emailed all his friends. Facebook was like Mark's friends. Slack was Stuart emailed all his friends. Gusto was friends and family. Stripe's first customer was one of the Collins's friend. Okta, Looker, Salesforce, their first customer is Mark Benioff's former colleague. Workday, one of their former colleagues. So that's where everybody starts. And as we go through these, it's not going to be like, should I do these all? It's more like you should probably try them all in little ways, but most of your success is probably going to come from a few. And it gets harder and harder the further you go out.
Do you think that closeness in social relationship or network has something to do with the ability to focus, like are people focusing product development on a particular person that they expect to sell to and they kind of already have that relationship, so it doesn't feel like a sales process? Or is it kind of like people often say, build for yourself, but is this a case of build for somebody who's like one hop away and you're kind of like deeply involved with their problem? Or is this, what's the pattern there?
So the first, like a part of the answer to your question is that step one of figuring out who your ideal user is and you want to build for them. What I found is the reason friends and colleagues are often your first users is nobody's going to trust this thing. Like a Salesforce is a good example. And Mark tells this story in one of the posts I quoted of just like, it takes a while to build trust that my company's going to adopt some new CRM, or Workday, we're going to adopt this new human resources product. So you need that trust from someone to take the leap. So I think it's more that if there's a reason to believe that it's worth trying.
So just bootstrapping trust with
Exactly. That's a really good way of putting it. Okay, I'm going to take notes. That's a good phrase.
By the way, I see
Yeah.
Peter Yang is saying we need this in a blog post ASAP.
This is what this is all going to turn into. It's going to be like an 8-parter.
And he requires a byline too. Oh wait, no.
For everybody here. Take a
Thank you
screenshot.
to all of my friends.
Yeah. Okay. What is that? Bootstrapping trust. All right. Look, this is already so useful. Okay, great. Okay. So yeah, it's a lot of that. Okay, so it starts with friends and colleagues. Then the next layer is you target specific strangers that are good potential examples of these target users. So for example, Cameo hired $10 an hour interns to just go out and DM potential celebrities, like C-list celebrities. Behance, Scott Belsky targeted designers and picked 100 designers, I think, on Twitter, and just found their emails and emailed them. Figma and Instagram, I think they did the same thing. Dylan and Kevin just kind of found designers on Twitter and reached out to them and wanted to show them his product. DoorDash, they just went door to door to restaurants. Substack went after successful online writers, just like found a way to contact them. Udemy went after successful experts like in programming and entrepreneurship. So that's the second layer. I'll kind of go through these fast so we have time to chat, but there's like 12 layers, so I'm just going to talk through them. So initially, friends and former colleagues, then strangers that are targeted, then online communities where these people spend time. So for Netflix, they found online DVD forums. Dropbox found Hacker News, and Reddit and Dig is where their users are. Robinhood turned out Hacker News. Facebook found the Harvard mailing list. That's where he started. So it's like where are people congregating already online. And then the next layer is offline communities. So for example, Etsy went to craft fairs, Lyft and Uber went to startup offices, Tinder went to college campuses, Snapchat, Evan went to malls. So that's like an offline place to go. The next layer is building your own community. It's kind of a rare one, but Product Hunt had an email list, Stack Overflow had a podcast, TikTok apparently spent a lot of time building a creator community. Then the next layer is influencers, where they promote your thing. So examples here, Spotify targeted music bloggers. Cameo had this like moment with this guy, Ronnie Radke, who I don't know, but apparently he broke Cameo almost because he brought in so many users.
He was one of the celebrity personalities that was creating?
He was one of the early Cameo users where, he's told him, I'm going to break Cameo. And he came on and he almost did because he had like thousands of people signing up for Cameos, which would take him a year to do. And he wasn't even delivering on them for days. And apparently the team was really freaked out that it was going to be the end of Cameo. It was a terrible experience for everybody. But then they just started seeing them trickle in. And they were really bad, like very dark, and he mispronounced people's names. And they were all very worried about the future of Cameo, but it turned out people loved it. They just like loved hearing their name said. They didn't even care about the quality, and they worked out well. So influencers. Okay, next layer is, and this like again is going further and further away from the founder. So the next layer is PR. Works for a lot of founder companies: Instacart, Udemy, Zillow, Spotify, Airbnb. PR was really effective. Then the next.
On PR, can we pause on PR for a second?
Yeah.
So there's a kind of I'd say like a more popular recent idea that everybody should be owning their own story and owning their own channels. And I think this is like, a lot of people will say like the value of something like a press outlet has gone dramatically down over time. So I think, let's say 15 years ago, people used to maybe launch their startup on TechCrunch. And then maybe 8 years ago, people used to launch it on Product Hunt. And, maybe more recently things happen in like maybe the, like Suhail's community for like, Friday, what's it called? Launching Friday.
Yeah.
And so, with that, and then I think there's a lot of commentary that, like Balaji and Naval and a bunch of people have talked about trying to really own their own PR kind of channels. So is that something that's in like a deep part of evolution right now? And have you thought much about how you would advise or suggest somebody thinks about PR today relative to maybe some of the ones you quoted or maybe some of the earlier generation?
I'm not an expert on PR, but I think I think the bottom line is you want to find something new every time a channel opens up. It's an amazing way to get a bunch of attention until it gets super crowded, and then you got to find the new channel. So PR, yeah, there's just like so many startups and so many funding announcements, and it's just like not an interesting way to find out about what's interesting now. And so Twitter, in a sense, is becoming that for some people. I think like podcasts were that, and still are that a little bit, like advertising in podcasts. And then newsletters are kind of an emerging way to get, like, it's a new emerging channel where nobody's really spending tons of money there. So it's maybe a little undervalued. So the bottom line is you just want to find a channel that is yet to be saturated, which is hard to predict where that'll be. But that's where creativity basically comes in, is like, where are people doing something new?
Yep.
And how do you get there? Yeah. And yeah, I love Balaji's idea that every company will want a chief content officer. I think it makes a ton of sense, especially as I think with SEO, like it's kind of like an SEO strategy where you need good content, and it's hard to do good content without somebody good focused on it. So I think that's where he's coming from at that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay, let me just finish these and then we can see where people's thoughts are. Okay, so PR, then there's like you can put physical things in the world. This is another way companies grow. So DoorDash had like flyers all over Stanford. Instacart put their logo on delivery bags. Grubhub put like signage in restaurants. It was one of the first companies to do that. So then, okay, the next layer is partnerships. Works for some people, like Netflix partnered with DVD manufacturers. Kayak, I think, partnered with AOL. That's one I'm not 100% certain on. And then there's two more. There's kind of these like marketplace specific growth levers that are interesting, where one is your supply drives your demand. So it's kind of like this, like Highlighter is a good example of this. Platforms and marketplaces have this magic power where your supply, in this case, I'm your supply. And in theory, I drive traffic to you because I'm here. And so this works for a lot of marketplaces and platforms. So like DoorDash, the way they grow is they get a restaurant, the restaurant promotes DoorDash to their customers because that's the only way you can get food delivered. And this is like how Caviar grows and Uber Eats grows. Etsy worked like this, Eventbrite, Substack, to like write Substack writers, send out a newsletter, tell everyone, come to my newsletter, and that drives users on Substack. So those are the layers. And then the last piece is the engines. So maybe we pause here and focus on this stuff, and then we can get to the engines later. What do you think?
Sure.
I mean, one thing that I was sort of wondering about is so core to a lot of the things that you mentioned in your previous posts is having a really robust personal network, like especially the stories where you talked about how people get their first tens of users, for example. So much of it is kind of built upon having like friends in different organizations you can tap into, or investors maybe. So I was wondering how, if that's like a very foundational element of growth that maybe cuts across a lot of stages and definitely helps you start up, how people should be thinking about that these days, not only like being remote, but also I think historically a lot of this has been done through Twitter. But now you have like so many kind of curated groups on Slack and Telegram, and like how should kind of founders who are looking to build on top of that layer of like personal network think about building it today?
So a few thoughts. One is that's most important in B2B is what I found doing this work. Most of the earliest, like the first 10 customers for a lot of the biggest B2B businesses come from their friends and their former colleagues and communities they're already in. So if you're building a B2B business, that becomes more important. Two, it tells you why YC is successful and communities like that, because a lot of the bigger companies like Stripe, Gusto, Amplitude, a lot of their early customers came from YC, which, you know, is the pitch for why you go to YC, but especially for B2B, it becomes, for that reason, more important. So if you don't have a community or a network, that's kind of where YC comes in. You're kind of like a way to bootstrap it without putting any work into it. But if you can't get into YC, if you want to do YC, the other way of approaching is just, join communities, participate in them, and become someone people trust. For example, a company that I invested in, they're finding a lot of success creating content on Reddit. They create this like interesting how-tos and they put on Reddit, and people find it valuable and they go check out the product. So that tells me is you can't just like join a community, hey, check out my stuff, it's so great. You want to provide value to the community,
Yeah.
or just become someone they trust already, and everything they say you're going to believe. And there's a good story of Netflix. They hired this guy Corey, whose job, he was like the black ops guy at Netflix, and his job was to infiltrate the DVD online forums and build trust ahead of their launch. And then when they launched, he's just like, hey guys, check out Netflix, it's so great.
Yeah.
And so that helped him a lot.
How long do you think it takes for somebody to bootstrap that new process? Like if you were going to try to find that, do you do that as part of the kind of in parallel while you're building the product, or do you find somebody who's connected to those communities already and you bring them on early, or how do you think about, like, what have you seen work there?
I think it just needs to be authentic and natural to you. It's hard to just like, in 2 years, I will start a company. So right. I will join a community today and start building a reputation. I think that's really hard, and nobody's going to do that. So I think it was like, ideally, you're building something you're already interested and excited about, which just naturally means you're going to be part of some community where people find it's valuable. Mm-hmm. But outside of that, I think it's just be part of communities. If you're thinking about starting a company that are interesting to you and maybe of value to the future, and participate and maybe valuable, but it's hard to do it authentically because you're just not going to be a good community member if you're like playing chess.
Yeah.
And it may work the other way. Join some community that's interesting. It may lead to a great idea that becomes super interesting. Like Shopify, Toby was like building a snowboarding business, and he just showed all the people in the Ruby on Rails community the snowboarding business, and they're just like, hey, we just want to use this for our store. Can we just use the store part of it and turn it into Shopify?
Yep. Yeah, I feel like when people follow their kind of where they just naturally have energy, it ends up being like a good pattern for figuring out how to fit in well. So I was actually talking to a guy today who's thinking about something new, and he was telling me about this book these 2 books that he's read, and about how he has all these ideas that interlink between the books that otherwise seem to be unrelated in the world. And I don't use a lot of the note-taking apps, but I've heard that there's like a whole part of the Rome research cult that is into like note-taking on books and creating connections. Whoa. And I could imagine that if you were to just start taking these notes and writing all of your interconnects and sort of getting involved in the Rome cult, you'd probably find just naturally interesting stuff there. But I think sometimes it helps to get a little bit of a push towards new tools or communities. And so I wonder if there's new ways to help people like encourage that energy, or help, like, when he has all of the like raw materials of interest, help him figure out that that's a place to plug into.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I love your point that you want to stay close to things that are energizing you and interesting to you and pull you in, because especially if you're starting a company, you're like committing for years and years to be working on this thing. And if you're not excited about it, then you're going to be unhappy. So don't force that.
Yeah. Another one that comes to mind, actually, in the kind of, he had built a lot of this before he launched it, is what Jack Conte did with Patreon, right? He was like a big YouTuber and a creator there, and he really deeply understood the problems of how tough the monetization was. And so he already had, 100 million views on his videos by the time he, put the first product together.
That's a good point. Another really good strategy that I didn't use but ended up being really helpful is just like building a following somewhere that you can use for other things. Like, and the way you do that is, I just find if you share value with people wherever you are, whether it's Twitter, newsletters, Instagram, TikTok, just like make them happy, make them laugh, make them smarter, make them money. If you can create value for people, they're going to follow you. And then as you have a following, you can use that when you end up launching something down the road.
So you're advising me to focus on my sea shanty and emojis?
I am fully behind it. Tell us where we can follow this on TikTok.
It's not there yet, but coming soon. We'll add it to the show notes.
Perfect.
But yeah, anyways, audience is ultimately optionality and trust for whatever you want to do later, right? People who know kind of what's on your mind.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I don't know if this is on topic, but I find that when you get like enough Twitter followers, you unlock the superpower where you can get answers on anything you're curious about from like hundreds of people,
Yeah.
where it gives them value also because they see all the answers, and then you can use it for what you're working on. It's pretty wild.
Right. Are there areas where you find that when people are creating, sort of around that energy to like maybe to figure out what's their voice on Twitter? Do you have any sort of recommendations and how to think about that?
Oh man, I try not to overthink Twitter and like have any sort of strategy or plan, but I think the bottom line is just provide value for people and be authentic about it and not be like too thirsty about likes and followers, and just like, this is interesting to me. Here we go. I'm going to share it. Like that's as simple as it goes. Just share things that are interesting to you or you think are valuable.
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, we took you on a bit of a detour, but
Twitter growth strategies.
Yeah.
So let me show maybe this last step of this thing and then see if this like is making sense to people.
Yeah.
So okay, so we talked about step 1, figure out who your initial wedge early adopters are. Step 2, figure out where you're going to pitch them. That's compelling. Step 3 is figure out where they are so you can go pitch them that. So that gets you your first many users doing these things and going through many of these concentric circles. Then eventually you're going to want to build a growth engine that will continue to power growth, because everything that we've talked about so far is not sustainable and it's not going to last. It's going to be like a spike of growth and then it'll go away. And so what you need to find is what's the thing that'll keep you going. So as a metaphor, one is like you're pushing the car forward and to get it rolling, and then you need to get an engine that'll keep it going. And it turns out there's only really 4 ways companies grow. Performance marketing, where you spend money to acquire a customer who generates revenue so that you can spend more money to acquire more customers, and hopefully you're making more per customer than you're spending on the ad. Pretty straightforward.
What's the canonical example there?
What's the what?
Like a canonical example there?
Like most D2C businesses are just like I have a mattress.
Booking.com or kayak.com or something.
Yeah, Wish is a really good example. It's just like pure paid growth, and they just arbitrage cheap things from China to ads, and they just found ways to just become incredibly good at running really high performing ads. Also, Booking.com mostly grows through this. Yeah, and so what's interesting is if you look at every company that's successful, one of these engines led to their success almost primarily. And then eventually you add more and more of these engines later. Like everyone ends up doing a little bit of SEO, a little bit of paid, but there's usually one that gets you going and then you layer on more later. So I guess as examples, DoorDash, I talked about, is mostly sales. Sales gets restaurants, restaurants bring customers. Pinterest, mostly SEO driven. TikTok was mostly performance marketing driven. If you look in their history, they just spend $1 bazillion on paid ads just to kind of get it going. Redfin, also performance marketing. Grubhub, mostly SEO. Robinhood, mostly virality and word of mouth. Airbnb, mostly word of mouth, virality. So yeah, so the 4: performance marketing, virality. The way that works is you bring on users, they bring you more users, and those users bring more users, and it keeps going. Then the third one is content, which is usually SEO, where you put out content, people find it or through searching, and then join. And the best version of this is your users are generating the content. So the more users, the more content, the more users. And then sales is the last, which mostly for B2B doesn't really economically make sense for consumer businesses. And so those are the 4. So the question basically, as a business, you have to figure out which of these engines is most likely to work for you, and then just how do you do it successfully. And something I found is you need to be the best in the world at one of these engines in your market. That's kind of the conclusion. You can like if someone is really good in, I don't know, let's say travel. Booking.com is really good at travel and paid growth, but that creates space for somebody can be really good at travel in content, SEO, and someone can be really good at travel through virality, word of mouth. And that's basically what happened. Airbnb is kind of viral, word of mouth driven. Booking is paid, and TripAdvisor and Expedia ended up being SEO and content driven. I think that's true. So that's an interesting learning. So
I'm curious actually on the Airbnb experience, because most of your 7 years of hands-on was Airbnb, as a growth area. And my understanding is that was mostly kind of the viral referral, kind of word of mouth stuff. Is that accurate, or?
So initially just word of mouth, basically. Like, so initially there was like the first step 3 that we talked about of how do you just get the early users, and that was mostly for Airbnb is mostly PR and building a community. They had meetups with hosts and got them kind of excited about the movement. But there's a lot of PR, but then eventually that spreads to word of mouth. So something like 50% of guests come from just word of mouth, hearing about it. And 70% of hosts, even today, come from just word of mouth, hearing about it from friends and in the news and things like that. And then referrals was a layer on top to optimize it. So let's say like 50% of growth comes from just word of mouth for free, like 20% comes from referrals, and then like maybe another 20% comes from paid growth.
Mm-hmm. So it feels like the word of mouth is kind of the story, or viral is sort of the big arc of the story, but then the referral stuff is kind of an optimization of that thing working.
Exactly.
I feel like, long ago there were these stories of early Airbnb around like the DNC, I think there was PR stuff there.
Yeah.
The Obama O's.
Yeah. It was all PR. It was great PR.
Were those, like, was there a nice dovetail where that transitioned out of being important and the other thing just kind of overtook it? Or what is that? Because you talk about sort of like you want to get good at one thing and focus on it. And it felt like, in a sense, they're good at PR, but then they transitioned to like this more sustainable, process-oriented word of mouth thing.
So it wasn't with word of mouth, you don't actually do anything. It just happens. It's like the best lever to grow through if you can make it work.
Mm-hmm.
And so the main thing that made it work is it was an amazing experience at a low cost. And there wasn't anything they were doing to like strategically grow word of mouth other than just, let's just make this great. And so this is actually one of my questions. There's like this in-between phase from like these turbo boosts that get things going, and then there's these engines later. But this middle ground is unclear. And I guess I'm curious if you guys know it, if you have any ideas around that, or if anyone in the audience has experienced this like middle ground and how you start transitioning from unscalable things to these longer term engines.
Yeah, are there other examples from Airbnb? Were you already there when the transition had occurred, or were you sort of?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I joined, I think it was like 5 years in. So when I joined, we actually had no idea where growth was coming from. It was just like, hey, everything's working. This is cool. Mm-hmm. Look at us go. All our experiments, everything's up and to the right. And it turned out it was just because it was all organically growing really well and people really enjoyed the experience. And so people wanted to talk about it. So Gustav, who's now at YC, he kind of created the first growth team, and they measured this for the first time by asking visitors, how did you hear about Airbnb? And that's when we learned it was like 50%, just like, oh, my friend told me about it. And then there was a bit of paid and a bit of referrals and things like that. Yeah. And I think that's how most companies end up. Like, nobody knows for a long time. You're just kind of assuming a lot, especially if it's viral driven.
Yeah.
Right.
What do you find that like the founders that you're advising, or the companies that now you're seeing kind of from a different perspective as an angel and an advisor, when they're in this middle ground, like what are they thinking about? What it's also individual, but like what frameworks are even useful when they're deciding like when do we pivot to a new strategy and how do we take the call about what that is?
The big question that companies have to think about is which of these engines is most likely going to drive their growth, because you have a lot of people like, hey, we're going to experiment with paid, or we're going to do some SEO, or we're going to try to increase virality. And knowing that one of these engines is most likely going to be the one that works, it's important just to figure out which one is most likely. And the first round piece that I think is linked in the invite, we share some heuristics about how to do that. So the main question is just like figuring out which one is most likely going to work. Then it's a question of how do you test it and start to get good at it. And that's basically where I find I can be most helpful. Like, for example, a lot of companies think they could just like poke around at it. Like, we're just gonna on the side experiment with SEO, and it turns out that just takes a long time to figure out. And if you know that's where you're gonna drive growth from, you should just commit to it and focus on it and move as fast as you can. But to your point, the question is like, how much? Like, when is it? Let's go all in on SEO versus like, oh, we're gonna keep working on going into communities and creating these other short-term flywheels. Hey, Peter,
Hey,
what's up?
how's it going,
Thought
man?
maybe you guys would know each other.
Yes.
You know, yeah.
Substack writers community.
For many forums, books and Slacks and Twitters.
Yes. So David, you brought me up to ask a question, right? To Lenny?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
You can just sit there. It's great.
Yeah. So Lenny, I was wondering more about the first two steps that you outlined. Like, how do you even know who your early adopters are, and like, you know,
So I haven't spent a ton of time there, to be honest. There are many smarter people on figuring out your ideal customer profile, I think is the acronym ICP. And so this is an area I'm going to spend more time exploring. But I think what you do is you take your best guess at it. Who do I think is most in need of this product? Who's got the biggest pain points? And let's just like take a swing at it. And the more niche and focused it is, I find the better versus like millennials. So like it's like Yelp found 25 to 35-year-old females were the most interested in Yelp. So then they focused on that market. So I think it's just, there's like frameworks you could go through to figure out your ICP that I'm going to actually link to in the post I'm working on, which is like, what's their pain point? What are they using now to solve that pain point? And then just like demographics. And then you just try it and see if your user plus your value prop is I like this word remarkable. I've been coming back to it a lot, which is just like, I don't know if you read that post about buzz, but remarkable just means it's worth remarking about. And so what you want to figure out is a value prop that is remarkable to the people you're pitching to, where they are like, oh my God, I want to tell people about it. And it makes them remark. So that's my advice, is find something where people find it remarkable. And either you have the wrong value prop or the wrong people, and you want to play with them over time.
Do
Cool.
you think it's more common that people hit the wrong value prop with the right people, or vice versa? Or?
I don't know. I don't have an answer.
Okay.
I was actually going to ask about that too. Like, when you're thinking about getting your first 100,000 users, like, when you have the sense that they aren't the right people, what should people do? I mean, like, if you're not pivoting your entire product and then it's more of like a clean break, like starting over, let's find a new audience, how do you kind of like tweak that or get a sense for if they're the right people in the first place also?
Where my mind goes is just thinking about most companies. It's very clear to them once they've found something that people really want. And so I'd say in a broad case, you kind of want to make radical changes if it's just not working, especially in consumer. And this is just like a broad generalization, but if you just look at when companies figured out they had product market fit, it's generally very clear. It's just like, whew, there it goes. And that's unlike anything else we've ever experienced. Not always the case, but so I think the general advice is try to change something radically if it's just not clicking.
Yeah. Laura, I know. Oh, sorry, go ahead. And then I wanted to pull Laura in. She had a bunch of interesting comments as well in chat.
It's like the first time I read Len's blog post, I was like, wow.
Product market fit.
Cool.
Actually, I am curious about that. As newsletter writers, I think you have some of these same kind of mechanics and tactics and processes that you must be thinking about, right? Like, certainly, like, I actually saw a tweet that I think, Lenny, you shared about when you first launched the newsletter and all the people you pulled in who helped you kind of like bootstrap it from your personal relationships. And then, I don't know, does SEO play a part of it today, or is it more like your Slack community, the growth of that helps grow the newsletter, or vice versa? Or?
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't think about this too much. I'd say in general, anything that I do, that I spend time on with the newsletter that isn't just like writing good stuff is rarely worth it and rarely does anything. So I've just learned that over time. Like I've tried Twitter ads, I've tried cross newsletter exchanges, I've tried what else, like other things, and they just don't do anything in the scheme of things. But early on, yeah, I guess I could try to put the stuff I did in buckets. I did guest posts. So I kind of went into other online communities, and then I found fans that had a following and built a relationship with them, and then asked them to tweet it when I launched. So those things worked. Yeah. Interesting. So meta.
Yeah.
Well, are you in any of those communities like Type House or those types of things where a bunch of writers all get together? Because I've got to imagine that is like, I mean, it's not a very transactional thing, right? It's like a very organic community thing, but because everybody knows each other and is available to sort of like help give feedback and promote each other's work, there's like a lot of probably organic, I don't know, juice in that today, you know, maybe what SEO would have looked like 15 years ago.
Yeah. With like Type House, people, it's mostly we like bitch about email platforms and media and things like that, less like promote our posts. Sure. And usually people in those groups are like already have a following. So it's not as useful for that. It's more just like having colleagues that are in the same lifestyle and just like bitching about stuff. And then to answer your question about SEO, I don't know, some small percentage of my traffic is SEO, but I don't think about it too much.
Just focus on the product. The writing.
Yeah.
That's what I find.
Cool. We invited Laura up here. Laura, I think you had a bunch of good questions in the chat. Welcome.
Thank you. Well, I guess I kind of take a slightly different starting point, and I'm curious about your thoughts, because I think there's a lot of alignment in how we're thinking. But I think that if you focus on people first and then focus on product, as opposed to being like, I have this cool idea, who's this going to work for? You can make things work a lot more quickly. And actually the process that I'm working on gives you the chance to just basically do like user interviews, like 10 user interviews, quantify the data, and understand the values that the people have in the context of the purchasing decision or the adoption decision or whatever. And in that way, you can learn about all of these things like the positioning and the where are they, and just do it a lot faster. Whereas I think when people have that innovator's bias and are like, this cool idea, where's my audience? It takes a lot longer.
Is this a product that you're building that you're talking about?
I'm supposedly writing a book, but there's
about how to do this.
My collaborator has been consulting with this method for many years, and I was a customer of his and used it in our product, and it was really cool. It was like, wow, like there's a lot of prep work, but just being able to like get to that real source of truth is cool. So
yeah, I completely agree with what you're saying. Like in the end, you need to solve people's problems, and the best way to understand how to do that is you talk to people and understand what problems they have and whether your ideas are solving them. So that's a really good point. Like I probably could frame this a little bit better, where it's not like go to people with your thing, but work with your potential audience to figure out what would actually solve their problems. I do find a lot of times it also works the other way. Like I don't know how Tinder, I think it probably starts with people have a problem they're solving for themselves, and then they realize, hey, other people have this problem, and so let's go pitch it to them. Like Dropbox, I think he just had this problem and he built it himself, and I don't know how Tinder works. Slack, yeah, exactly. Slack, like all these pivots that happen. So you're right. There's a big element of customer development and talking to your users, understanding their needs. It's a good point.
Yeah, it actually reminds me of one of Nadia is in the audience, and one of our mutual friends was really obsessed with this TV show called Skam that got really popular in Norway. Like most of Norway has watched this show, and it's kind of like this teen drama, but the creator, the showrunner, actually spent like months and months, like literally in high school classrooms, just talking to high schoolers and like doing a very intense kind of UX, like user interviews process, and then came up with this. Maybe it's like more kind of accepted to do this in the media industry when you're kind of like piloting shows or testing user preferences for certain types of like music or media content. But I really like that point as well, as sort of the people emphasis as a definitely like very important thing in the beginning, but probably an overlay to the entire process.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's the other point I'll just make is that in the context of ethics, which some people think is important, starting with people first can also help with this, because I think a lot of the things that are sort of side effects of growth techniques that have been used in the past could be avoided if you're a little bit more people first. So
That's such a good point. On that point, actually, while I have people here, I want to do a post about just like humane growth and how to think about the balance of growth versus human needs and happiness. If anyone knows anyone that would be a good contributor to this or would have thoughts on how to approach this, I would love to know, because I haven't found the right people to work with us.
I can put you in touch with some good folks.
Okay, amazing. Just DM me if my email is not available. Okay.
What do you think? What do you think? Is it humane growth? What do you think that might?
I don't know what to call it. Oh man, I don't have the answers.
But are you trying to find something that, I guess, like, I think a lot of the negativity that may come with some of the more technical growth stuff is stuff that's very like attention grabby or very like, funnel optimizy. And so do you have something in mind that maybe, kind of an extreme opposite of those types of things? I mean, like, one thing that comes to mind might be like content creation is not really like funnel optimization. It's kind of the opposite. It's just like delivering value instead of delivering tactics. And it feels like that kind of stuff is, maybe more common these days. So I don't know if like content creation as a form of growth, not virality, or not kind of like, I guess tactic funnel optimization stuff.
This is such a deep and nuanced topic that I want to be careful going too deep into it. But I think in the end, businesses need to grow if we are in a capitalist society. So the question then is just, how do you grow in a way that isn't harming people? Because in the end, we're like actually damaging people for growth. What's the point in the end?
The main problems have come when the customer and business interests aren't aligned. So when customers are the product, then we see a lot more problems. Whereas if you're providing something that's valuable to people and you make money from that, then you're in a much better space.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a big part of it. Like advertising based businesses innately will be challenging. I think the trick is like people at a company are incentivized to help it grow. That's like their job, and their performance is judged on how much are you going to help us grow. So I think the answer is probably like broadly principles that companies have to stick to, where they don't cross some line of like, this is too far, like this many push notifications or this much daily usage or something like that. I think that's one approach. The other is, maybe just like no more advertising based businesses, but that feels hard to do and probably goes too far. But this is a very interesting topic that I really want to spend time on, and I wish I had the answers. But it's So
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, definitely DM me, Laura. I'd love to talk. Sorry, you were saying something?
Oh yeah, I was just saying. I think with certainly it's a nuanced topic, and we're not going to prosecute the whole thing tonight. But it wouldn't surprise me if the idea of advertising-based businesses, not only doesn't function to serve, in the future ways that we want technology to serve us, but may become like, I don't know, regulated away as a reasonable way to interact with the world. Like, I don't know. I mean, on the decades-long thing, does advertising itself become illegal?
Wow, big thought.
Yeah.
Wow, interesting.
Camilo, also, you had a couple comments in the chat on this topic. I thought it would be interesting to pull you in as well. Often, I hadn't heard of that before.
Yeah, no worries. And thanks for hosting this. It's been a super interesting conversation. I just came across this concept yesterday. There's an article in GeekWire, which is a pretty big publication in Seattle, about the idea of a Temtech, which is basically treating the users not as commodities, but actually build meaningful, sustainable engagement. And the community building is kind of like the primary focus. And I'm very green to a lot of the ideas that Lenny you mentioned, which is kind of why I'm here. But it does seem that the quality of the content attracts people, and then the quality of the people is what determines the strength of the community. And it seems like some of the companies featured in that GeekWire article that I put in the comments are very thoughtfully going around building their user base in this manner. So I thought it was who knows, maybe this has been iterated in some way, just not called that. But I think in Seattle, there's certain entrepreneurs that are trying to name this so that it can be more intentional. And, we'll see how their growth, how they mature as companies. But once you kind of were explaining that piece, it just kind of popped that alarm bell.
Cool. That's a good term, authentic. It sounds like a security term, though. But
maybe it's like the Seattle B2B heritage subconsciously playing in, but I like it.
Cool. Thanks for sharing that. I will dig into that.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah, I feel like this whole conversation is kind of interesting because the building blocks that you sort of talked about that might make their way into this grand unifying theory post, it's sort of like what you should be thinking through as a founder, like figuring out your wedge and where you should pitch people and where you find those people. And then this like overlaid layer across the whole process of almost like the why I feel like we've been talking about in the last few minutes, like why are you doing this in the first place and who is it for? And what are the sort of checkpoints that someone should use in the beginning and throughout the process to sort like help that calibrate also how you're going through these very tactical kind of growth steps as you're thinking about building out your growth engine.
Yeah,
So,
and I think, sorry to interrupt.
Oh no, that's it.
I think that's where like core values of a company come in, and then just the principles of what success means. Like I was just listening to an interview with Andy Radcliffe at Wealthfront, and one of their core values is like everyone talks about this, so I'm curious how much it actually impacts what they do. But just like the customer is always prioritized over the business, and they always think very long term. Like it all sounds nice, and I don't know. I imagine they actually stick to this in some way, but I think those are the kind of things that out of control bad behavior, at least for a while. But the trick is like eventually businesses in our economic society need to keep growing. And so eventually you're just like pressured to find other ways to grow that don't feel great. So that's the trick, is when you like really have to make decisions. How do you make the right decision?
I think what Max is doing with the firm has been kind of this principled approach to financial services, and he's kind of talked about it for the whole life of the company. And I think that's another version of kind of a more, maybe it's a humane version to growth, is like they lead with the fact that they are not going to have the hidden fees and all of the kind of scammy techniques that emerge in the kind of typical financial services and credit and loan industries. They really focus on, in a sense, almost, I would still call it's a capitalist system, but they're taking a very hard line against some of the traditional practices, and that's not only a differentiator, but also, kind of core to the operational.
Yeah, I think that's how this happens. The founders just have to create these rules that people have to play by, and then it's up to them to deal with the pressure that will come at them if growth is not high enough, and stick to these rules.
Yeah.
I think some interesting questions have come up here. What I'm hearing from people in the chat and just throughout this conversation is like, what do you do in those fuzzy stages you mentioned, Lenny, like when you're sort of in between, maybe like the engine starting to kick off? How do you decide when that's happening? How do you grow responsibly and like humanely? And then also like what's different now? I think that would be interesting to touch on as well in a post like this, in terms of people thinking about building a community pre-launch or getting press, or some of these strategies that you talked about before with examples from companies in the past. Like what's different in a world that's increasingly remote and also like very scattered in terms of where your people live.
Great.
Yeah.
I'm taking notes in case it looks like I'm typing.
No.
If sorry to interrupt, if I might add something that was brought up early on in the conversation that I was trying to reconcile is you mentioned the idea of, you know, a lot of your early users are going to be friends and family, but I think you mentioned step number one is find the audience. So my question was like, how do you reconcile that? Maybe your bias is to think that your ideal customer are your friends and family, and that might create a blind spot in really figuring out whether that's actually a market. But then second to that, it makes you think of how do you, if that's your lens, if that's kind of like what you're looking at, are you really ensuring you're designing for everyone and designing inclusively from the beginning, right? Because, you know, people tend to have very homogeneous friends and family circles. So when we talk about tech for good and being developed in a more humane way, does that create that bias from the beginning, which is really hard to undo later, right? Because then more complexity, more risk, more stakeholders, et cetera, et cetera. And that was just something my mind was wrestling with when you established it at the beginning.
So I think what would help unreconcile that a little bit, I'd say the friends and family stuff as a first strategy is mostly effective for B2B because it takes a while to convince someone to buy a thing. For consumer apps, like, sure, you can email all your friends and they might use it, but it doesn't really matter because you need millions of users. So they're not going to really significantly impact your growth. So then you quickly move on to other layers. That's just one thought. The other is like who you go to. Like there's so much depth to this that I don't know, we could go deeper, but there's like, I think Laura pointed out, there's this like customer development loop that happens as you're going through this where you're evolving the product. And your point partly is, I think you may evolve into a product that isn't the right product because you're biasing towards your friends and family. So I think, yeah, for sure. So the answer is like, don't start with that. Start with what do you want to work on as a human? Where do you think there's a big opportunity for business? And then you move on to where are these people that will use this thing? And the friends and family is just like a nice way to get started, but that shouldn't drive what you're building.
Yeah. And the kind of like, what do you want to work on and where are these people? That's what made me think about that it would be a really interesting angle if you talk about kind of like, how do you find these people if everyone is living all over the world and largely on the internet, like what's the kind of early vetting if you can't be on a college campus, like handing out flyers or, I mean, things will go back to normal, but I think a lot of people are increasingly like finding their people in very niche kind of online communities.
Right. And then offline communities are like not an option.
Yeah, exactly.
Eliminates one layer.
Yeah. Like this blog post that Nadia Egbal wrote, and it sort of has this illustration of the web. I feel like thinking about growth in the context of some of those middle layers where it's not like the Twitter, Facebook, like super public, super distributed, but you're more thinking about growth bootstrapped on top of like very powerful, kind of more underground communities is interesting.
Yeah. It makes me think about GitHub started with like open source engineers, like a very like, I don't know, tight kind of nerdy community where they're just like, wow, this is what we need. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of good examples of companies just like finding one little random group that we're really excited about. And to your point, a lot more people are online now and in random communities. And so that's an interesting, just new thing that's emerging is there's probably like more online communities. So that's kind of interesting. It's a new way of maybe bootstrapping something that serves that community.
Yeah.
But I think the important thing is it needs to be authentic and valuable to the community. It can't just be like, here I am, download my app. Here we go.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it can't just be like the like Pinterest for insert X or like, I don't know, product for like insert some niche community, but how do you actually find something that the people need?
Right. Yeah. Therein lies the challenge.
Yeah. Also, as another like overall layer to all of this, it makes me kind of think of like the question of the grand unifying theory of growth, like for whom? I guess people are initially thinking of it, accustomed to probably thinking of it in terms of startup founders, but there's so much stuff around the creator economy, and like you're living this right now as your own reality. But like what? I mean, that could probably be its whole own blog
That's really
series.
interesting. Here, I'll tell you how I'm thinking about this.
Yeah.
Because I think it's a good way of, it could address what you're pointing out, which is really smart. So we had this series of kickstarting and scaling a marketplace business. And what I'm thinking is I'll have a kickstarting and scaling a consumer business, kickstarting and scaling a B2B business, and then I could do a kickstarting and scaling a creator business.
Yeah.
Whoa, that's a great idea.
That would be so cool. And then like, I'm sure there are elements that you pull out of all of those and say like, generally as someone thinking about growing a thing that you make that is in the world, like what are these very macro kind of themes? But then you can split it up into almost different disciplines in a way.
Wow. All right. Great idea.
I'm just brainstorming out here.
That byline.
I want to read all of these posts. So.
Mishti by Mishti.
Yeah. But I mean, no, this has been great. So much stuff has come up. Are there other things, Lenny, that you're curious about, and we can ask people and follow-ups or kind of like get people engaged to kind of think back with you even after this ends?
The thing that'd be most useful that's come into mind is just if you have stories of things that have worked for you to drive growth, ideally good growth and humane growth, I'd love to hear them. Whether you're a tiny startup or later stage. So if you could just DM me, I'm just Lenny San, S-A-N, on Twitter, of just like, hey, this really worked well for us to get us thousands of users or tens of customers. That'd be awesome.
Awesome.
Yeah, awesome.
We'll
include that in the follow-up email that we'll do when we mail out kind of the summary.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I know we're a little bit over time what we'd sort of planned to spend together, so I will move towards wrapping. I first wanted to thank you, Lenny, for spending the time with us. It's been awesome. I think we always have a lot of fun when we get, a great person and thinker together with a bunch of good writing and then a bunch of thoughts in the room vibing. So
thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us. And we are coming to the end of the time, but we do have a question that we often ask at the end, and I don't think we prepped you on this.
No.
So we'll see what comes off. But we sort of spend a bunch of time here, oftentimes like asking you questions, and we want to also turn the tables and figure out, outside of kind of the core topic of grand unifying theory of growth, are there other questions that you have in mind right now, like whether it's flippant or funny or philosophical, what else is on your mind? What are you curious about these days?
Whoa. This is deep and many-layered ways we can go. I don't know, climate change, I think about, and how what we should do. Like, it's so hard to know as a human what I should do other than like donate money here or invest in startups that are doing something for climate. So I'm always looking for things I can do that have some sort of impact. I don't know. That's like a big one. And then I don't know, a little one is I'm trying to find more. I find that I read books and then I just like, it all goes away. It all like fades quickly. And I'm trying to figure out ways to like optimize that time that I spend reading without like sitting there taking notes the whole time. So that's always on my mind. Like, man, that's like hours of life. And then just like a year later, I don't know what I even read.
Some people say a good book should be like a good meal.
Where you just enjoy it and then it's just entertainment. Yeah.
Some parts of it stick with you in various ways.
Or
you turn it off.
My whole library is just like every 3 pages is dog-eared, and then like there's only so much of that you can hold into a brain.
Yeah, like, and I never go back to these dog-eared. I'm like, I will go to these highlights and read them every year, and I never do.
Yeah,
I do feel like I mentioned before, but I do feel like I've heard a lot of buzz around Rome Research having a lot of these communities for notes and interlinking. So I wonder if there's actually a solution there where
just outsource your brain to these other people.
You can find, and I think you can also like revisit a lot of topics that people sort of maybe they've captured, and you read the book 6 months or a year ago, and you kind of want a refresher. There's also a great blog that I look for. This guy named I think it's blaz.com. Yeah, which I'll share here. I want to say Blake Moros, if I recall correctly. And he does these amazing summaries of books, and he reads tons of books and takes tons of notes. And so anything, he's kind of probably a little nonfiction oriented, but probably plenty of stuff. Plenty of stuff that kind of, the sort of Silicon Valley builder tech business flavored books.
Very cool.
Really great summary. So
the rabbit hole.
So dig in on the rabbit hole. Great.
Good tip.
Well, with that, then we'll wrap. I got one more quick announcement, which is Darcy Kulikin from A16Z is going to be with us next Wednesday, and we're going to talk about the Social Plus writing that he's been doing.
He's awesome. Great guest. Ask him. He wrote an amazing post about marketplaces that I reference often, about how you don't need to, I don't know, this is very nerdy, but like a lot of people think with marketplaces, you have to have high order value and high frequency. And he kind of found you don't actually need that. And that blew my mind. So that's a question to ask him if you want.
All right.
That's cool. We will
We'll do that. And
awesome.
You're welcome to come too if you want to hang with us.
I just might.
All right. Well, thanks so much for spending the time, Lenny. We loved it.
Yeah, thank you all. Thanks for staying with this audience.
Thanks for coming, everybody. All right,
everyone.